The room in court was filled with a heavy silence, a silence that seemed to press down on your chest, making each breath feel like an effort. Every seat was occupied, and all eyes were fixed on the man positioned at the center of it all. Sergeant Nathan Carter sat in his wheelchair wearing his military uniform. The medals on his chest gleamed under the overhead lights, his hand holding the leash of the dog beside him. Thor, a German shepherd with a calm, yet watchful presence. To everyone else, Thor appeared to be a standard military working dog. But, to Nathan, he was much more. He was family. Nathan's jaw tightened as the judge spoke to him, reminding him that this might be his last chance to speak. The army had decided Thor was to be reassigned, considered government property, needed for another mission. After years of risking their lives together, the idea of losing Thor now felt like a cruel act of betrayal. Nathan's hands trembled as he adjusted his grip on the leash, his voice barely steady enough to speak. "Your Honor," he began, his tone filled with raw emotion. "Thor isn't just a military asset. He saved my life in ways no one here could ever comprehend. In the field, he pulled me from danger, shielded me from gunfire, even warned me of traps before I could see them. And when I came home, when I couldn't even face myself in the mirror, Thor was there. He gave me a reason to keep going. Please, don't take him from me." The room remained completely still, the air thick with unspoken sympathy. Some spectators dabbed at their eyes while others exchanged glances, their expressions showing a mix of pity and outrage. The judge's face remained neutral, his eyes studying Nathan for a long moment before he leaned forward, preparing to deliver his ruling. But before the words could leave his mouth, something unexpected happened. Thor stood suddenly, pulling the leash free from Nathan's shaking hands. The dog moved toward the judge, barking sharply, his voice echoing through the courtroom. The crowd gasped, and the bailiff stepped forward instinctively. Though Thor showed no signs of aggression, his barks were insistent, purposeful, as if he were trying to convey something urgent. "Thor!" Nathan called, his voice breaking with panic. But deep down, he knew he had seen this behavior before, many times on the battlefield. Thor wasn't just barking, he was alerting. The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder. "What's wrong with the dog?" someone whispered from the back row. Nathan's chest tightened as he wheeled himself forward, his voice trembling. "He's not just barking. He only does this when there's danger. He's trying to warn us about something." The judge froze, his gavel forgotten in his hand, his eyes locked on Thor. The room fell silent again, except for the dog's barks echoing like a heartbeat. Whatever Thor sensed, it wasn't just about Nathan. The dog knew something no one else did, and for the first time that day, Nathan felt a flicker of hope. This wasn't just a goodbye. Something bigger was about to unfold, and Thor was determined to make them all see it. The room was silent except for Thor's persistent barking. Each sharp sound echoed in the large courtroom, bouncing off the dark, wooden walls and cutting through the tension like a blade. Thor's stance was low, his body tense, ears pinned back, and eyes locked on the judge's bench. Nathan's grip tightened on the armrests of his wheelchair as he watched the dog. This wasn't random barking. Thor's body language was unmistakable. He had detected something. Nathan's heart pounded, a rush of adrenaline reminding him of moments on the battlefield. But this wasn't war. This was supposed to be a courtroom, a place of order. "Thor, heel!" Nathan called, his voice firm but trembling. Thor briefly glanced back at him, his gaze sharp as if to reassure his handler that he was in control. Then, without hesitation, Thor returned his focus, pacing in short, deliberate steps in front of the judge's bench. His barks shifted to deep, guttural growls that sent a shiver through the room. The audience began murmuring nervously, the earlier sympathy for Nathan now morphing into palpable unease. "Mr. Carter," the judge said, his tone laced with irritation, "control your dog, or I will have to." "Your Honor," Nathan interrupted, his voice louder, steadier, though his chest tightened with fear. "Thor isn't misbehaving. He's trained to detect threats, bombs, explosives, danger. He wouldn't act like this unless he felt something was wrong." The room fell silent again as Nathan's words settled in. His explanation shifted the atmosphere, replacing skepticism with a creeping sense of dread. Before anyone could respond, Thor suddenly stopped barking. The abrupt silence was jarring, almost deafening. Thor's body went completely rigid as his head snapped toward the far end of the courtroom. His ears perked sharply and a low, menacing growl rumbled from his chest. The shift was so sudden, so intense, that even the judge froze. All eyes turned toward the heavy wooden doors leading into the courtroom. A collective unease settled over the room, and the murmurs turned to panicked whispers. Nathan's breathing quickened as he followed Thor's line of sight, his pulse thundering in his ears. He had seen this exact behavior before on the battlefield, moments before Thor uncovered a buried explosive or signaled an enemy ambush. Whatever Thor sensed now wasn't good. "Thor," Nathan whispered, his voice breaking with tension. What is it?" Thor didn't move. His entire body remained locked in place, his growl growing deeper, vibrating through the air like a warning. Whatever danger he had detected, it was no longer just a threat to Nathan. It was something that could put everyone in that room at risk. The low growl from Thor reverberated through the courtroom like distant thunder, freezing everyone in place. All eyes were fixed on the dog, his body tense, his gaze locked on the heavy wooden doors at the far end of the room. Even the judge, who moments ago had been prepared to reprimand Nathan, now seemed unnerved. His gavel remained forgotten in his hand as he exchanged uneasy glances with the bailiffs. The air felt electric, thick with a tension that no one could explain. Nathan's breath came faster, his hands gripping the armrests of his wheelchair as if bracing himself for a blast. He had seen this before, too many times to count on the battlefield. Thor's instincts had been the difference between life and death. His warning had always meant one thing: danger was close, very close. "Stay calm," Nathan murmured to himself, but the words felt hollow, even to him. The bailiffs, unsure of how to proceed, hesitated by the judge's bench. One of them, a man, with a broad frame and a wary expression, finally stepped forward, his hand resting on the weapon at his hip. "It's just a dog, right?" he muttered, though his voice betrayed his own unease. Probably reacting to the noise or the crowd. But even as he spoke, his steps were cautious, his movements deliberate. Nathan shook his head, his voice rising just enough to cut through the murmurs of the crowd. "No, Thor doesn't react to noise or people like this. He's trained to sense danger, things we can't see. Trust me, if he's growling like that, there's a reason." His words hung in the air, and for a moment, no one moved. The judge, visibly unsettled, finally nodded at the bailiffs, motioning for them to investigate the door. Thor's growl grew louder as the bailiffs approached the door. The larger man reached out hesitantly, his hand gripping the metal handle. For a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. Nathan's heart pounded as he watched, every muscle in his body coiled with anticipation. Thor's body remained rigid, his growls turning into a series of sharp-clipped barks as the handle began to turn. The door creaked open, revealing the dark hallway beyond. At first it seemed empty, but Thor's barking only intensified, his eyes fixed on something unseen. The larger bailiff took a step into the hallway, his hand still on his weapon. He glanced, back at the courtroom, his face pale, and then turned forward again. A second later, his voice broke the silence. "There's something here." Nathan's pulse quickened as he leaned forward in his chair, his chest tight with dread. Whatever something the bailiff had seen, it was enough to make Thor's instincts flare to life, and Nathan knew better than anyone. Thor was never wrong. The air in the courtroom seemed to grow heavier, as if the tension itself was pulling the oxygen from the room. Thor's barking echoed sharply, each sound reverberating off the wooden walls. His body remained locked in a stance of pure alertness, muscles taut, head low, and his gaze fixed like a laser on the dark hallway beyond the open door. The larger bailiff, now visibly uneasy, took another hesitant step forward, his boots clicking softly against the tiled floor. His hand hovered near his weapon, his body stiff with caution, as though expecting something to lunge out of the shadows. "What's going on out there?" the judge demanded, his voice cracking slightly despite his attempt to maintain authority. He gripped the gavel tightly, his knuckles pale, as his eyes darted nervously between the doorway and Thor. The dog's growls deepened, a low, menacing rumble that vibrated through the courtroom and sent shivers down the spines of everyone present. The larger bailiff glanced back toward the room, his face pale and tight with uncertainty. "I don't see anything," he said hesitantly, his words measured. "But something doesn't feel right." His gaze shifted back to the hallway, his brow furrowed, as if trying to shake off his own doubts. "It's quiet, too quiet." His voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried through the silent room like a gunshot. Nathan leaned forward in his wheelchair, his stomach twisting into knots. He had heard those words before. Too quiet, countless times on the battlefield, and they had always preceded disaster. His voice rose, cutting through the rising murmurs of the crowd. "Thor doesn't react to nothing. If he's acting like this, there's a reason. We need to evacuate the room now." His command rang with urgency, but the spectators froze, paralyzed by fear and confusion. The smaller bailiff stepped forward, drawing a flashlight from his belt and aiming the beam into the hallway. The bright light cut through the shadows, illuminating the length of the polished floor. "There's nothing," he muttered, his tone uneasy. "It's just an empty hallway." But even as he spoke, his hand trembled slightly, betraying his calm facade. Thor, however, was far from calm. The dog's growling only grew louder, his barking more frantic, as his body strained forward, almost yanking the leash from Nathan's grip. Suddenly, a sharp metallic clang echoed down the hallway, the sound unmistakable and jarring in the suffocating silence. The smaller bailiff flinched, his flashlight beam shaking as he instinctively stepped back. Thor lunged toward the sound, barking ferociously, his claws scraping against the floor as he strained against his leash. Gasps erupted from the courtroom, and panic began to ripple through the crowd. The larger bailiff instinctively drew his weapon, his voice tight with alarm. "What the hell was that?" Nathan's heart pounded in his chest as he raised his voice above the chaos. "Get Thor back!" he yelled, his voice trembling with a mix of fear and certainty. "He's never wrong. Something's coming!" But before anyone could respond, the metallic clang echoed again, louder this time, as if whatever had caused it was now much closer. The air felt thick, charged with an invisible energy that sent a wave of dread through the room. Whatever Thor had sensed, it was no longer a question of if, it was now a question of when. The metallic clang echoed again, sharper, closer, like an alarm ringing in the depths of the hallway. The tension in the courtroom snapped tighter, the weight of the unknown pressing down on everyone present. Thor barked ferociously, his body straining against the leash as though his sheer will could push through the doorway and confront whatever was out there. Nathan gripped the leash tightly, his knuckles white, his pulse racing in his ears. He could feel it now, too. Something was wrong. Something was coming. The larger bailiff stepped fully into the hallway, his gun drawn and his eyes scanning the dimly lit corridor. His partner followed cautiously, flashlight trembling slightly in his hand. The beam cut through the darkness, but the hallway appeared empty, silent, and still. Yet Thor's barking didn't waver, his growls growing deeper, more insistent. Nathan's instincts screamed at him to act, to shout for an evacuation, but he could already see the fear paralyzing the room. No one was moving. "Do you see anything?" the judge called out, his voice cracking as he leaned forward in his seat. The gavel trembled slightly in his hand, and his usual air of authority was replaced with an unmistakable edge of fear. The larger bailiff glanced over his shoulder, his face pale and glistening with sweat. "Nothing yet," he said, his voice low but tight, as if he were afraid that speaking too loudly would provoke whatever might be lurking. "But it doesn't feel right." He took another step forward, the weight of his boots echoing down the hall. The spectators in the courtroom whispered nervously, some clutching their belongings, others inching toward the exits. The uneasy energy in the room was spreading like wildfire. Nathan wheeled himself forward slightly, his eyes locked on Thor, who had gone silent again. The dog's ears were rigid, his body motionless, his eyes still fixed on the open doorway. "Thor's locked onto something," Nathan said, his voice trembling. "I don't know what it is, but it's there." And then, just as the bailiff reached the halfway point in the hallway, a shadow moved. It was brief, barely perceptible, but it was enough to make the smaller bailiff stumble backward, his flashlight beam jerking wildly. "There!" he shouted, his voice filled with panic. The larger bailiff froze, his gun snapping up, aimed at the darkness. Thor erupted into barking again, lunging so hard against his leash that Nathan's grip nearly gave out. "Back up!" Nathan shouted, his voice echoing in the courtroom. "Get out of there!" The judge slammed his gavel, trying to regain order, but the sound was swallowed by the growing chaos. People were rising from their seats, murmurs turning to shouts as the panic spread. And then from the darkness of the hallway came another sound, a heavy, deliberate footstep. It wasn't hurried. It wasn't rushed. It was calm, and it was getting closer. Thor's barking turned into a snarl, his teeth bared as his body pushed forward with unrelenting force. Nathan felt his chest tighten as dread flooded his body. Whatever was in that hallway wasn't in a hurry. It wasn't hiding. It was coming straight for them, and it wanted to be seen. The heavy footstep echoed louder than the courtroom could bear, cutting through the growing chaos like a blade. Thor's snarls filled the air, his body pulling against the leash with such force that Nathan had to anchor himself in his wheelchair to keep from being yanked forward. The tension was suffocating now. Every pair of eyes locked on the dark hallway, the source of the sound that no one wanted to face. "Everyone stay calm," the judge shouted, slamming his gavel again, but the command fell on deaf ears. People were rising from their seats, clutching their bags, their hands on anything they could find, as if holding on to something would save them from the unknown threat. The larger bailiff stood frozen in the hallway, his gun raised and aimed into the darkness. His partner remained behind him, the flashlight beam darting nervously across the walls, catching every shadow, but revealing nothing concrete. Nathan's voice broke through the mounting noise. "Get out of there!" he shouted, his tone sharp and urgent. "Whatever it is, it's not safe." His words cut like a knife, but the larger bailiff didn't move. Instead, he squinted into the dim corridor, his jaw tight. And then the shadow moved again. This time it was unmistakable, slow, deliberate, purposeful. The smaller bailiff gasped, audibly, his flashlight shaking in his trembling hand. "There's someone there," he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. The light caught something for a fraction of a second, a silhouette, tall and looming. It disappeared almost as quickly as it had appeared, retreating back into the darkness, but it was enough to send a wave of fear rippling through the room. The larger bailiff tightened his grip on his weapon, his voice steady but low. "Show yourself," he barked, his tone commanding. "Step out where I can see you." But the only response was silence, thick, oppressive silence that seemed to stretch for an eternity. Thor's barking reached a fever pitch, his teeth bared as his body coiled like a spring ready to lunge, and then it happened. The figure stepped into the light, slowly, calmly, almost uncaring. It was a man, his face obscured by a hood, his hands tucked into the pockets of a heavy coat. His movements were deliberate, his posture oddly relaxed despite the chaos he'd caused. He stopped just at the edge of the flashlight's beam, his head tilted slightly as if amused by the scene in front of him. Thor's growling turned feral, his claws scraping the floor as Nathan strained to hold him back. "Who are you?" the larger bailiff demanded, his gun locked on the figure. The man didn't answer. Instead, he took another slow step forward, the faintest hint of a smirk visible beneath the shadow of his hood. Nathan's breath caught in his chest as an overwhelming sense of dread washed over him. Something about the man felt wrong, not just threatening, but deeply, fundamentally wrong. The man raised his hand slowly, the motion causing both bailiffs to tense and grip their weapons tighter. "Relax," the man said, his voice low, calm, and chillingly confident. "I'm not here to hurt anyone." But the way he spoke, the way his words lingered in the air, only made the room feel colder. Nathan knew immediately this man was lying, and Thor knew it too. The room fell into a stunned silence as the man stood at the edge of the hallway, his figure partially illuminated by the unsteady beam of the flashlight. Thor's growls were now constant, low and guttural, vibrating through the tense courtroom. The bailiffs held their weapons firm, their hands trembling despite their years of training. Nathan's heart hammered in his chest as he stared at the stranger. The man's posture was too calm, too deliberate, as if he thrived on the unease he was creating. "Step forward slowly," the larger bailiff ordered, his voice tight with authority, though a hint of fear seeped into his tone. The man tilted his head slightly, his face still obscured by the hood, and then took one step closer, his boots clicking softly against the tiled floor. He moved with an unsettling confidence, each movement slow and calculated, as though he were savoring every second of the attention now fixated on him. Thor barked furiously, lunging forward against his leash, his claws scraping the floor. Nathan struggled to hold him back, his palms slick with sweat as his grip tightened. "Thor, no," Nathan muttered under his breath, his voice trembling. "He can sense it. He knows something's not right." His words weren't loud enough to reach the crowd, but the judge glanced at him briefly, his expression a mixture of fear and confusion. The smaller bailiff stepped forward, flashlight in one hand, and his other hovering near his holster. "Sir," he said, his voice cracking slightly, "identify yourself now." The man finally lifted his head, his face partially visible beneath the shadow of his hood. His eyes were sharp, cold, and piercing, holding an intensity that sent a chill down Nathan's spine. "I'm not here to hurt anyone," the man repeated, his voice calm yet unnervingly hollow. He reached into his pocket slowly, causing both bailiffs to stiffen and raise their weapons further. Gasps rippled through the courtroom, and someone in the back whispered, "He's got something." The room felt ready to erupt, the tension a fragile thread that could snap at any moment. Nathan's instincts screamed at him to act, but he was frozen, gripping Thor's leash as if it were the only thing anchoring him to the moment. The stranger's hand emerged from his pocket, holding something small and metallic. The bailiff shouted in unison, "Drop it!" The man froze, his lips curling into a faint smirk. "Relax," he said smoothly, holding the object up. It glinted in the dim light, revealing itself to be a simple key. But Nathan's unease only deepened. There was no relief in the air, no sense of safety. Thor's barking didn't falter, his focus locked on the man, as if the key was nothing but a distraction. Nathan's grip on the leash tightened as he whispered to himself, "It's not what it looks like. He's hiding something. He has to be." The man's smile widened, as if he could hear Nathan's thoughts, and the dread in the room became suffocating. The room felt like it was on the verge of implosion. All eyes were locked on the man holding the key, his smirk a sharp contrast to the panic spreading through the courtroom. Thor's barking was relentless, his growls deep and guttural, as if trying to sound an alarm no one could ignore. Nathan's hands trembled as he tightened his grip on the leash, his chest heaving with the weight of his instincts, screaming louder than the chaos around him. Something wasn't right. This man wasn't just a threat. He was the tip of something much larger, much darker. "Drop the key and back away," the larger bailiff barked again, his weapon still trained on the man. The smaller bailiff edged closer, flashlight steady, but his face pale with unease. The man, seemingly unfazed by the guns pointed at him, tilted his head slightly, his gaze flickering toward Thor. "That dog," he said, his voice low and almost conversational. "He's special, isn't he? Always knows things before they happen. That's what makes him so valuable." His tone was calm, but the weight of his words sent a ripple of dread through the room. Nathan's stomach dropped. How did this man know about Thor, about his abilities, his instincts? The hair on the back of Nathan's neck stood on end as he forced himself to speak. "How do you know that?" he demanded, his voice sharp and shaking in equal measure. Thor barked even louder, lunging forward against the leash, as if trying to protect Nathan from something only he could see. The man's smirk grew, his eyes glinting with something sinister. The stranger slowly raised the key, his movements deliberate, almost taunting. "You'll find out soon enough," he said, his voice chilling in its certainty. And then, with a sharp metallic click, he turned the key in his hand. The sound was subtle, but its effect was immediate. Thor erupted into a frenzy, barking louder than ever, and before anyone could react, the lights in the courtroom flickered violently. A moment of pure darkness swept through the room, and in the black void, Nathan could hear gasps, shouts, and the scrape of chairs as people scrambled in fear. When the lights flickered back on, the stranger was no longer alone. Behind him, emerging from the hallway like shadows come to life, were two more figures. Their faces were obscured, but their movements were deliberate, their presence radiating menace. Both were holding weapons, sharp metallic shapes that caught the light just enough to make their purpose clear. Nathan's heart raced as he looked at Thor, who was now growling so ferociously it sounded almost primal. Whatever was happening, it was no longer just about a man with a key. This was something much, much bigger, and it had just begun. The courtroom descended into pure chaos. Spectators pushed toward the exits, voices rising in confusion and fear, while chairs scraped loudly against the floor. The two figures behind the stranger moved further into the room, their presence alone enough to send a ripple of dread through everyone. Thor barked incessantly, his body low, every muscle in him ready to spring forward. Nathan's grip on the leash tightened as adrenaline surged through him. He knew without a shadow of a doubt that the stranger wasn't bluffing. Thor was the reason they were here. "Everyone stay calm," the judge yelled, slamming his gavel again, though his voice was drowned out by the panic swelling in the room. The larger bailiff stepped forward, holding his ground, his flashlight now focused on the stranger. "Stay where you are," he commanded, but the stranger didn't stop. Instead, he took another slow step forward, his movements deliberate, his expression eerily calm. The figures behind him mirrored his pace, adding to the suffocating tension. The stranger finally spoke, his voice smooth and measured, cutting through the noise. "No one needs to get hurt. All I want is the dog." His words were calm, but the undertone of authority in his voice sent chills down Nathan's spine. Thor growled low, his sharp gaze locked on the stranger, unrelenting in his stance. Nathan's heart pounded in his chest. "You're not taking him," he said, his voice strong but edged with emotion. He wheeled himself slightly closer to Thor, keeping his hand firm on the leash. "He's not just a dog. He's my partner, my family. I don't care who you are or what you think you're entitled to. You're not taking him." His words hung in the air, and for a moment, the entire room seemed to hold its breath. The stranger's smirk faded, his eyes narrowing as he studied Nathan. "You're making this more complicated than it needs to be," he said coolly. His gaze shifted back to Thor, the faintest hint of frustration flashing across his face. "He's special, you know that. But keeping him will only make things harder for you." Nathan's jaw tightened, his grip firm on Thor's leash. "Thor stays with me," he said firmly, his voice unwavering. Around him, the murmurs of the crowd swelled again. Some voices calling for calm, while others whispered in fear about what was going to happen next. The tension in the room felt unbearable, every moment stretching into an eternity. Thor barked sharply again, snapping the room back to the present. His focus on the stranger was absolute, as if he knew exactly what was at stake. Nathan's chest tightened as he leaned forward in his chair, ready to do whatever it took to protect the one being who had never let him down. Whatever the stranger's intentions were, Nathan was certain of one thing. Thor wasn't going anywhere, and this standoff was far from over. The courtroom was thick with tension, every person in the room frozen in a state of unease as the stranger stood motionless, his eyes locked on Thor. The dog's low growls rumbled like distant thunder, his body still coiled and ready to defend. Nathan, gripping the leash with both hands, stared directly at the stranger, his own determination reflecting the unwavering loyalty of his partner at his side. The two figures behind the stranger remained still, their presence looming but no longer advancing. It was a standoff, one that seemed to stretch on endlessly. The judge, breaking the heavy silence, cleared his throat and spoke with all the authority he could muster. "You've disrupted a court of law. This ends now. Bailiffs, escort these men out of here." His voice trembled slightly, but it was enough to reignite the tension. The bailiffs, regaining their composure, stepped forward cautiously. Thor let out another sharp bark, his teeth bared as his eyes followed every move the strangers made. The stranger raised a hand slowly, signaling his companions to stop. His expression shifted, not anger, but something closer to resignation.
"This isn't over," he said calmly, his voice carrying an ominous weight. "You think this is just about the dog, but it's much bigger than that. You'll see soon enough.
He took a step back, his smirk returning, but there was no warmth in it. Only a cold, calculating confidence. For now, I'll leave. But he belongs to us, Nathan. And we'll be back. Nathan's chest tightened, his grip on Thor's leash never loosening. He belongs to no one but me, he said firmly, his voice steady and clear. And whatever it is you're after, you'll have to go through both of us. His words struck like steel, and for the first time, the stranger faltered, his eyes narrowing, as if assessing Nathan one final time. Then, without another word, he turned, motioning for his companions to follow him. The tension in the room didn't ease until they had disappeared through the same doors they had entered from. The silence that followed was deafening. Spectators slowly returned to their seats, whispers rippling through the crowd as they tried to make sense of what had just happened. The judge exhaled deeply, setting his gavel down with a shaking hand. "This court is adjourned," he said wearily, his voice barely audible over the murmurs. But Nathan remained where he was, his eyes still fixed on the door. Thor finally sat down, his growls fading, though his body remained alert. Nathan reached down, his hand gently brushing over the dog's head. "You did good, buddy," he whispered, his voice heavy with gratitude and exhaustion. As the courtroom slowly emptied, Nathan stayed behind, his thoughts racing. He didn't know who that man was or why they wanted Thor, but one thing was clear: this wasn't over. But for now, as Thor leaned against his leg, Nathan let himself feel the quiet relief of this moment. Whatever was coming, they would face it together, because no matter what happened, their bond was unbreakable, and that was something no one could take away.